and thank you for everyone for being here today. We understand that this could have been a good day to plant, as many of you may have been doing otherwise. In fact, Allison and myself have been preparing and planting a soybean field earlier today, and so I apologize for my appearance. And so this webinar is part of the National Association of Plant Breeders webinar series. In 2017, it is titled Building Better Plants for the 21st Century, Updates and Upgrades in HTP, IP, and DNA. And we've had several talks. This is the 6th and final talk in the series. We hope that you will access the previous talks online and watch the recordings. Today, we are very pleased to have with us today Fred Allen from the University of Tennessee. I'm going to turn it over to Allison in just a minute to give his introduction. But before that, I just want to point out the hats that both Allison and I are wearing. We're very proud of the accomplishments that Fred Allen has achieved. And Allison is wearing an UT agronomic variety testing hat, which Fred ran that program for the last 15 or so years of his career. I'm wearing an Allen soybean hat, which is named in honor of his prodigious accomplishments in agriculture. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison to talk a little bit more about Fred's background.
Hi, so a little bit about Fred Allen. He is a professor emeritus here at the University of Tennessee. He started here in 1975 and founded our soybean breeding program that we are so proud of. He became the department head and served in that role in 1996 until 2001, and also served as the coordinator for the statewide variety trials, where he had the opportunity to streamline the program and create some standardized plot sizes and replications and seeding rates across the state at in 25 counties here at UT Extensions, and with various agents and specialists. And additionally, he's also influenced several undergrads and research associates and grad students as their graduate advisors, and he's just done wonderful things for our university. And I am ready to turn the time back to, also I wanted to tell you guys about his soybean line that he was known for, that he had produced. It's Roundup Ready 1 back cross derived soybean line, and it's the Allen line. And in 2012, he was named fellow to Crop Science Society of America. So we're very proud of him. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris and Allison, for the kind and generous introduction. It's my pleasure to do this presentation today. And I want to thank Chris for the invitation to do the presentation. And I also want to thank Dr. Vince Pantalone, who is our current soybean breeder at the University of Tennessee. About half the slide pictures that you will see today are from Vince, courtesy of Vince, so I appreciate that very much. And as you can see from title slide, I'm ancient enough to remember soybean breeding before the IP rights, and then to some degree after IP rights. And so today I'm going to talk about some of that. So that's what Chris has kind of asked me to review some of the history there. So that's what I will do. And as we go through the presentation, if you have a question at any point in time, please ask those questions. I will take a break in the presentation about halfway through and give an opportunity to ask some questions before we proceed for it'll be the pre-IP days, and then the second half will be the post-IP days. So an outline of what we're going to talk about. I'll quickly, again, overview my personal background to let you know where I'm coming from in preparing this presentation. And then I will show a flow chart, kind of an overview of soybean cultivar breeding process prior to the IP rights. And if you're a plant breeder, and particularly with self-pollinated crops, you certainly will recognize the steps in the process And I will talk about some of the things that were available to us pre-IP. And then, as I said, in the second half, I'll talk about a lot of those changes that have taken place and responsibilities that have been added since we've had intellectual property rights. So that'll be the second half. And then I'll end up with a summary of impacts that the intellectual property rights have made for breeding programs. And I'm going to talk strictly from my experience and background here at the University of Tennessee in the soybean breeding program. As Allison indicated, I was hired to start the program here. And so my experience comes from that. And I don't pretend to expand these beyond that, but I think our program here is very similar to a lot of other public soybean breeding programs and would be true of self-pollinated crops as well. My background, I have a BS degree in agronomy from Tennessee Technological University, got an MS in plant breeding at Virginia Tech, a PhD in plant breeding at the University of Minnesota, and I worked in the barley breeding program there. And the breeding process we followed there, very similar to what I set up at the University of Tennessee, since barley is a self-pollinated crop. So many of these steps will be the same for soybean breeding as well. And as was indicated in the introduction, I was hired in 1975 to develop a soybean breeding program here at the University of Tennessee. There was some breeding work that had gone on in the 1940s and resulted in a couple of releases. One of them was Vol State, and the other one, I'm having a senior moment of the name of the other. But anyway, two were released during that time, and both of them are fairly popular varieties in the early days of soybean development in the United States. I directed the program from 1975 through 1998, and in that tenure of that, released 13 soybean varieties for Tennessee and the Southeast. Served as department head of plant soil sciences at UT from 1996 through 2001, and then returned to the faculty as coordinator of the statewide variety testing program, as Allison indicated, both for soybean, corn, small grains, grain sorghum, and specialty crops. We even got involved in some switchgrass at a point in time. So did that from 2001 and through 2015, and then retired at the end of 2015, and currently still meddling a little bit in plant breeding, conducting a small breeding project on strawberries. Okay, we'll go through the steps of breeding program, soybean breeding program, as a background for what I'm going to talk about changes. And the first one of those in the steps is accessing germplasm for parental sources and crossing. And that's a biggie for all of us. And obviously the first source of materials is your own breeding program. But in the early days, I didn't have advanced line, so I relied heavily on other breeding programs throughout the Southeast and other breeders to share material, and they generously did. And so it was a real jump start to my program. The other source is other university and USDA breeding programs, and in the 70s and 80s, all the way up through most of the 90s, we had very exchange germplasm, some material transfer agreements or any of that sort of thing had to be signed. We had agreements if you went into if you put lines in the USDA cooperative test, and those are available for crossing for anyone that was growing the test. At that time, private company cultivars were available. Most everything was under PVP protection, but the PVPs allowed for use of the cultivars as parental sources and crosses, and not many restrictions there. So in the 70s and 80s, we were using private cultivars as parents in our crossing program pretty extensively. USDA soybean germplasm collection, that was open and still is open access, and this is where we obtain many of the sources of resistance to things like soybean cyst nematode or frog eye or sudden death syndrome, all those kinds of things, but it's used pretty extensively for nematodes, which is a big problem in soybeans, and that was total open access and still is. Private company gene technology owners, and so this was in the really in the early 90s. We began that process before the advent of Roundup Ready when it was about to come out, but it got pretty hot and heavy during the late 90s. And I'll review more of that here in a few minutes. The next step is generation advance to approach homozygosity. And so for that, about every program is using some sort of a procedure to do generation advance rapidly. And in our case and many others use winter nurseries and advance those along, trying to get them up to about F5 or F6 generation and then start more intensive selection. Next step, testing and selection. And the single plants, typically in the program here, we would get back F6 generation material out of winter nursery, start selecting single plants to develop plant rows, and then eventually developing experimental lines and then putting those experimental lines into test, ones that could make the selection process, obviously, and then putting those out at different locations in the state. In the early stages of yield test in Tennessee, we would use 2 locations and make decisions, one in East Tennessee and one in West Tennessee. And Tennessee is a very long state, so geographically and climatic-wise, we're quite different from east to west. And so we have 3 grand divisions here, East, Middle, and West Tennessee. So we tried to sample at least a location in East Tennessee and West Tennessee where most of our row crops are grown early in the process. And then we'd expand that as selection and testing went further. We'd also then put them into USDA tests, the cooperative tests that all the breeders would grow with a prelim and uniform test in Tennessee and then throughout the Southeast, so to get greater information on the broader adaptability of the experimental lines that we were advancing. And then after we got to the point that some looked promising, put them in state variety test here in Tennessee, and then put them in Southeast region where we felt like the particular line was adapted, and we were breeding for maturity groups 4 and 5 primarily, in early days even a few 6s. But we'd put them in the states where the maturity, we thought the eventual marketing might be viable. Then release as a new cultivar. The process is that you would present that to the experiment station release committee, and this is true in other states as well, for review and approval, actually, to release a particular variety. And not everything got approved. So in some cases they would turn it down or come back for, or tell you to come back with more information later on to see whether it was worthy of release or not. So in a few cases we had that. And then in early days too, we would have cooperating states. So once things got into the USDA test and the breeders around the region was able to see the performance of the lines, the different states, any of the other states could cooperate in release of a variety. And in many cases you would have multiple states participating in release of a variety that was coming out. And the one that I remember clearly was Hutchison coming out of Virginia Tech, and that one got everyone's attention as it came through the testing process. And I think there were 7 states that participated in release of Hutchinson. Then the next step, obviously, once you got the new line released, would be seed multiplication and distribution. And in our case, it was Tennessee Foundation seed. The breeder seed would be turned over to Tennessee Foundation seed, and those Foundation seed growers would then produce from the breeder seed, produce seed to distribute to a wider group of certified seed growers, and in our case, Tennessee, obviously. Then Tennessee Crop Improvement was involved, and other states, their Crop Improvement Association too, and their responsibility was to inspect and certify public cultivars. And that was their sole function. The Foundation seed is strictly a Foundation seed organization to maintain the seed for distribution to the seed growers. And so there's no marketing involved. Neither of those organizations was allowed to put out any marketing information about different varieties. Then the Tennessee certified seed growers, they sold the seed to the soybean producers. Most of that was in-state, but occasionally they would be selling seed to producers in other states as well. Next step, marketing. And in the early days from the mid-'70s all the way through mid-'90s, actually, there's no formal organized marketing. So in public soybean varieties, it's very difficult to get information out to the growers on a broader scale. And so the private varieties were coming on the scene very strong, and they were doing lots of marketing. So it was difficult to compete, more and more difficult to compete with the privates because of the marketing that was going on. And our marketing strategy, we put out extension publications with descriptions and information about the variety. We'd use the state variety test reports to get the information out. We'd have articles in farm publications, word of mouth by farmers. That was some of the best marketing strategy, still is. One farmer talking to his neighbors about a new variety he's been trying, and hopefully good outcomes with that. In a few cases, we put out a color trifold pamphlet to pass out, particularly at the Ag Experiment Station Extension Field Days. So we try to distribute the information that way. But marketing was not really a big push in those days, and it got more and more difficult to get good information into producers' hands to get new varieties accepted. So that was a challenge. So to look at the whole process, and if you're a breeder and particularly self-pollinated crops, that process is not unfamiliar to you, from the crossing to the release and marketing of a new variety. And in the days that we were working with, it was about a 10-year process. If you made a cross till you had a success at the end of a new variety, took about 10 years. We figured out different ways along the line to shave that off a bit, and most of that was in winter nursery, by leaving material in the winter nursery a little longer and getting broader testing earlier in the cycle. So we could cut that to about 7 years in a lot of cases. So I want to stop at this point and see if you have questions before I move into the changes that are taking place at each one of those steps along the line. So have any questions at this point?
No questions at this time, Fred.
Okay. All right. So I'll proceed on. Obviously, with intellectual property rights, once the Roundup Ready soybeans came on the scene in 1996, then the activities in that area increased dramatically for the seed companies as well as universities. And So at Tennessee, University of Tennessee, we had several changes that started happening in the mid 90s. Our seed growers in Tennessee are very progressive and forward thinking group. And so they too could see what's coming down the pike with these gene technologies and the possibility that our university programs could be locked out of getting access to that technology if we didn't do some things that were being required and we knew were going to be put in place. So one of the first things that happened, and I mentioned earlier that Foundation Seed and Tennessee Crop Improvement couldn't do advertising of varieties, and there's no official marketing strategy. So in 1996, our certified seed growers in Tennessee, they formed a marketing association called Tennessee Advanced Genetics, which became a Monsanto approved marketing affiliate. And that was another requirement that we knew was coming down the line, that if you're going to market Roundup Ready varieties that are developed in the program, you had to have an approved marketing outlet or an affiliate. And so the person that was largely responsible for driving all this was the executive director of both Tennessee Foundation Seeds and Tennessee Crop Improvement, David McKinney. And he worked tirelessly to get this thing going with our seed growers. And so TAG, when it was formed, they were the ones that would keep the records of production. They'd collect the technology fees as well as royalty fees, and that satisfied the companies like Monsanto because obviously they wanted their technology fees from any new varieties that were developed. And then in 1997, Tennessee Ag Experiment Station, which is now referred to as UT Ag Research, signed a research agreement with Monsanto Company that allowed us to incorporate the Roundup Ready gene technology into the soybean breeding lines in the program here. And we were the second university to get that approval. I think Georgia beat us to the draw on it by a few months, but we knew that for our varieties to compete in the future, then we were going to have to be able to access the technologies that were coming along, and we were very fortunate to get the Roundup Ready 1 technology into the program. Also that same year, UT Ag Research signed a MOA or Memorandum of Agreement with TAG to grant TAG the first right of refusal to market our soybean variety releases as well as the small grain cultivars that Ag Research released. And it also allowed TAG to sublicense cultivars to other marketing firms if they so chose. And you'll see in the next step how that helped is that in that same year, then TAG worked with Crop Improvement and Foundation Seed organizations in the Southeast U.S. to form a 9-state regional marketing organization. And so Dave McKinney, again, was forward thinking and looking here that to market these things, we need to market much broader than just Tennessee. And so our certified seed growers in Tennessee and other states were struggling, and they needed access to varieties. So you can see all the 9 different states that were involved in this forming what we called Unisouth Genetics, or USG. And that organization is active now. So it's a regional group that was started on the template of what we had for Tennessee Advanced Genetics. And so now TAG can sublicense to USG, and that's usually what happens every case because we want as broad a marketing as possible. And so USG then can market into all these states, and they do soybeans and wheat primarily. Then in 2009, our experiment station administration, UT Ag Research, developed and implemented a royalty policy for released plant cultivars. And so our distribution of royalties are as follows. You can see it's 10% to TAG or Tennessee Advanced Genetics, 20% to the experiment station, 20% to the originating plant breeding program. So soybean varieties, 20% would go back to the soybean breeding program. If it's wheat variety, 20% go back to the wheat program, so forth. And then a little bit different wrinkle that was patterned after what University of Georgia had was 10% to a cultivar development fund. And that fund is administered by the UT Ag Research Administration. But any of the breeders of any crop can put in a proposal for funding from that particular fund to assist in their program. So, for example, a wheat breeder may have a line that needs to be increased in the winter nursery, and so they could propose getting funds to help support that and multiplying the seed and getting quantity blown up to either put in larger tests like state variety test or that sort of thing, or they may even increase it for release. And then finally, the other part is 40% to the developer or developers and cooperators. And I'll talk more about that in a moment here. All right, so we want to talk now about the post-IP rights and how it's changed that breeding process and what other kind of responsibilities have been added to the steps in each one of these. Of course, accessing germplasm, UT program advanced lines, that's still not any problem. But the next step is other universities and USDA breeding programs, whereas before we never had to sign a MTA or an FTO agreement. Now, for any of the lines that you want to cross with from another university or from a USDA program, you've got to get an MTA. So if you're operating a breeding program, you know how many parental materials you're trying to access every year to make crosses. And so every one of those has to have an MTA. So you've got multiple MTAs and a lot more time and effort involved in accessing getting the seed. And the packet of seed must come from the breeder. Yeah, you can't, in the early days, we could cross in border rows in a regional test, and you can no longer do that. You can't save seed from any of the plots. You know, the seed must come directly from the breeder. Private company cultivars, there's no access these days. Even with written request or agreeing to sign MTAs or research and development agreements, you can't do that for most of the private company cultivars. Private company gene technology owners, still now you have to do a research and development agreement. And in the early days, we could do a research agreement, and then we'd still have to do a marketing agreement. But now if you get a research and development agreement, you can proceed for marketing, but again, the marketing has to be through an approved affiliate. USDA soybean germplasm collection, fortunately, that's still open access, and I don't believe there's any requirements for signing a material transfer agreement on any of that stuff. So that's great because we really need access to that valuable resource for all kinds of disease and insect resistance and nematodes and that sort of thing. And it's a real gold mine for those kinds of things. Now we have available in soybeans a USDA diversity test, and that was started by Dr. Tommy Carter at NC State with USDA, trying to broaden the germplasm base and crossing with a lot of so-called PIs, but they're very elite lines out of other countries, a lot of them out of China. But even to do those, then you've still got to sign a material transfer agreement or a FTO, dependent. Now several states are participating, so you'd have to sign agreements to get access to that material. And there's another test that's been added in soybeans, quality trait test, and I'm thinking other crops, there's similar kind of things going on. This one was formerly funded by the United Soybean Board, but now it's a USDA uniform prelim test. So it involves multiple states. The breeders can participate in it if they choose. And again, if you get any material out of that or want to use any material out of that, you've got to sign an MTA. Generation advance. Again, things have changed in the winter nursery scene. Obviously, with all the herbicide trait technologies that's come on the scene, winter nurseries have had to set up isolation blocks for the tech traits, and a lot of limitations and restrictions on that, and higher cost to the plant breeder. A winter nursery facility must be qualified facility by the gene tech owner, so you can't just use any winter nursery facility and meet the approval of the gene owner. Commercial tolerance for herbicide traits. This is an added thing even in the winter nurseries. For example, I think for the Roundup Ready 2 now, the protocol is you can spray the recommended rate every generation beginning with the F1s, and you must continue that all the way through. In some cases, the performance of the lines, they have to be sprayed at the 2x rate, and you can't have a reduced performance in that. So some of that's been added to some of the trait technologies that are available. Testing and selection, changes that have come about there. Single plants, as I just mentioned, one of the things that has to happen now is a commercial tolerance for the herbicide traits. They've got to be sprayed. Same thing for experimental lines. They must meet the commercial tolerance. And then when you get an advanced line that you think you're going to be moving forward, it must be tested by a third party for adventitious presence. So you can't have other genes in there, get the herbicide traits mixed up that you don't have permission for. So it has to be tested to demonstrate that it does not have other genes present. Yield test locations in the state. In many of the cases, in most of the cases, at least in the early days of the herbicide traits, you had to use gene owner specified commercial checks. And so you could put your own in there added to it, but you had to use ones that the company specified also, and you had to outperform the checks that were required to put in a test. USDA prelim and uniform test. You need gene owner approval for test in different states. And so in the case of soybeans, again, the person that coordinates the cooperative test with USDA has got approval from the different companies to test out for different states. State right test. If you're going outside your state, like if we're putting lines in Arkansas test or Missouri or Virginia or wherever, then we have to have gene owner approval for test out of the state. So another added responsibility there. Marketing company test, in the case of USG or Unisal, they do their own line test across different states, and they too have to get approval for testing in the different states. Okay, to the release stage of releasing a new cultivar, we still have the Ag Experiment Station Release Committee. Now you got to determine the royalty amount per unit of seed, so you got to figure in a technology fee, how much it's going to be for administering the fees, and then distribution of the royalty fees that's going to be charged for the originators as well. Cooperating states, now that just any state can't participate in release. In our case, they have to go through, you have to be a member state through Unisouth Genetics. And so that's limited to the 9 different states that are members of that marketing association. Multiplication and distribution, changes again brought about. Tag, as I mentioned earlier, license from UT, and then sub-license a new cultivar to USG. It's produced and marketed in those 9 different states that are members. Crop Improvement Association and USDA member states, Crop Improvement Association, they do the inspection and certifying cultivars. And most of that now is quality assurance, and a QA tag is issued rather than a certified tag, but it basically is the same inspection process as before that has to meet the all the breeder description of the variety and all the purity standards and that sort of thing too. In our case too, Tennessee certified seed growers sell seed to Tennessee producers as well as producers in other states. They can sell in other states that are not necessarily members of USG if they get a request to do so, and then the USG members market in the member states too. Marketing has become official and organized. USG marketing or other licensing company, they use multiple venues to get the information out. They still use the state variety test reports, the online and hard copy materials. And we have done several surveys in Tennessee, and over 90% of our soybean producers and corn producers use the variety test information that the University of Tennessee develops. And so our producers do pay close attention, and you have to be in that top group to sell much seed in Tennessee anyway. So it has become has been important for a long time, but it's really important now. Articles in farm publication, now we have paid ads in those. Word of mouth by farmers is still a really important marketing mechanism. Farmer testimonials in farm publication, most of those are paid ads. And then still the ag experiment station and extension field days, but much more emphasis on marketing strategy. All right, summary of the impacts. I think it is a positive thing, the intellectual properties rights. And so it gives universities greater control, ownership rights, and marketing potential for the cultivars and gene technologies developed by their scientists. So the marketing efforts itself, the amount of seed that is sold, and in our case through UniSouth Genetic, is much greater than what it used to be. Royalty policies provide a mechanism to transfer funds back to the originating breeding program if that's the policy in your particular state, and it's true in ours, as I indicated earlier. So that's a good step forward. That's a way, if you get a really good variety that can provide some support back to the program, that's really helpful. Royalties provide set-aside funds, as I mentioned in our case, and Georgia, I know, has the same thing, that can be accessed by all the breeding programs, and that's a great benefit to help in cultivar development. Royalties provide personal monetary support to developing plant breeders and colleagues that have participated at it pretty intensively. So all of those are great positive benefits to the intellectual and been brought about by intellectual property rights. The downside, loss of some germplasm access, superior private varieties I mentioned not available to use as parents, and in some cases a few public cultivars are not available to use. And so you've got restricted access to some prime germplasm that's coming out of the private sector. Higher seed cost to producers. The technology and royalty fees add to the seed cost, and so no question that that's driven up seed prices. Paperwork. Substantial increase in the paperwork for all the MTAs and FTOs and research and development agreements that you have to get as a breeder. And so the paperwork is, you got to get started early these days to work on that just to get material that you want to cross with. Additional time required for all the legal reviews and negotiations and approvals to get the MTAs and research agreements and all that. And our breeder here has worked on one of the herbicide traits, trying to get access to that. He's worked on it 3 years and still does not have access to that gene technology. So it can be time consuming and very frustrating at times. Money, additional cost to the breeding program for meeting specific protocols. I mentioned there's certain check cultivars you got to put in. You got to take more precautions in the winter nursery. You got to spray the herbicide on the different generations that you're multiplying through the process. So all that's costing quite a bit of money. All right, so that summarizes that. So do we have any questions at the end here?
There are no questions at this time, but we'll take a few minutes and hang out, give folks an opportunity to gather their thoughts.
Okay.
So, folks, if you will, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in. Q&A or chat is fine. Fred, I'm curious, just the general, this is coming from a sort of a neophyte's point of view with the historical perspective you've got. I'm just curious, seeing the changes with IP rights and all these things, like generally, do you think it's been a good thing for the ag industry and maybe your industry specifically?
I think overall it is a positive step forward, because it does allow, in the legal climate that we live in, it allows the universities to capture their advances as well. You know, some of that comes at the expense of the farmers, but our farmers understand too, if we're going to stay in the business and compete with the private companies, this is the game that's got to go on. And so for the breeder, it's a lot more, as I said, time and cost and that sort of thing. But I think the positive benefits of breeder getting to share in royalties and getting support back to the program, which really helps in plant breeding programs, because there's not much extramural funding out there available for cultivar development. So it's got to be generated through royalties or fees or something. So I think overall it's a positive thing for the ag industry too.
But now you mentioned for research and educational institutions, I mean, generally when you think IP rights, you think about for-profit organizations. But you also, sounds like you also think it's been good on the academic side too?
I do, yes. I think just for the fees and the protection of the technologies and that sort of thing, I think it's beneficial to the university.
Okay, great.
And to our ag industry too, because the soybean boards and other commodity groups support the breeding program, and so it's a way for them to recoup some protection of the money they've invested in the program as well.
Okay, great. Okay, folks, still no questions. We'll take another. We'll just take another minute and hang around. I put a link earlier in chat to other. A link to learn.extension.org, which includes not quite all. I think there have been 6. This is the 6th webinar in this series. That link will at least show 5 of them to you. And again, feel free. This one will be in that. If you click on that link, this one will be the first one listed there. A recording of this will be available there within a few days. Feel free to share that with colleagues or friends that might not have been able to attend. And it looks like we do have one question that popped up. So Isfin says, thank you for this excellent talk. I agree with the usefulness of MTAs between private and public breeders. However, I'm not sure of the need and benefit for public to public breeders. More paperwork is involved and delays could cause the breeder not to be able to use a parent when they need to. I would like to believe that we as public breeders still have trust in each other. Second point, we have been able to access private lines for crossing, so it's not true that we are completely shut out of the exchange. So,
okay,
comment more than anything else. Fred, you have a reply or a
well, and
follow-up?
the first point there of breeders trusting each other and MTAs, I think they're exactly right. It's not the breeders don't trust each other. Excuse me, but it's the legal ramifications of each of the institutions, and they're all trying to protect their rights and if things are developed to have their share, excuse me, that type of thing. So it's not that the breeders don't trust each other, but it's the necessary legal things that have to be done in the climate that you work in these days. And the second one with the private, that's good news if they can access some, and if for different crops or whatever, that's probably true. I'm just referring to soybeans here in our experience. So.
All righty. So no other questions at this time. Chris, any closing thoughts on your end?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, again for being here today. Thank you for joining in with the series if you did. As Mark mentioned, there's a link to view the recorded webinars from previous talks. And I also want to mention, I just put up a link to the annual meeting for the National Association of Plant Breeders in 2017, which will be held in Davis, California from August 7 through August 10. And please join us there if you can make it and hear more about breeding, about lots of different crops. And thank you again.
All right. Thanks, folks.
Yeah, thanks for
Thanks
your
again, Fred.
participation. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.